A third of our patients are triathletes, marathon runners. They work out to beat the band. They do everything perfectly. And that's actually a little more scary because that means their genes are having a big say in why they can't sustain who they are. So in that conversation, what I like to bring up is that everyone's unique. And so you might have been 36, somebody else might have been 29, and someone else might be 41, where they detect those differences. But it's going to happen because none of us outlive Father Time. And that's where disease begins to permeate and show up. And then we know it's there because we feel creaky. We can't get out of bed so easily. We can't play 3 full rounds of golf a week. All of that makes a difference. Welcome to Everforward Radio. I'm Dr. Florence Comite, and I'm here to talk about my favorite topic, how to reverse aging and stop disease in its tracks so that you can live life to the fullest. And I'm delighted to share all the data that we've accumulated over the years and the stories to help everyone out there enjoy life to the fullest.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Everforward Radio. I'm here with Dr. Florence Comite to talk about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, but is also something that I am personally after in my personal life. And that's really longevity, human optimization. I feel like in a lot of ways, I have a lot of strong foundations covered. Now I'm just looking to maintain them, optimize them a little bit more, really each and every year, as now I'm getting into my late 30s, but that doesn't mean if you're not in your late 30s, you can't find value in today's message. So today we're going to be talking with Dr. Florence, like I said, about how to quantify your own health and then make key changes that will reduce things like belly fat, reduce risk of diabetes, revitalize your sex drive, and strengthen your erections for us guys out there. And something we all could appreciate, give you more muscle and greater mental agility, something we all could appreciate here and now, but in the long haul of life. So with that, Dr. Florence, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I got to ask, as an author, as a medical provider, as someone who is clearly taking all of these lessons into your own application and then now sharing this information with the world, why this book? Why now? Why is this information so important to you? And why do you feel it's so important for us? Great
question. It's a little tricky to answer because the why this book, why now? I actually wrote the book back about 10 years ago because I've been in the field for over 2 decades, looking at what happens when we age and why we age. Does our body decline in every way you just mentioned? We gain body fat, we lose muscle, diabetes, heart disease, stroke emerges. We can't keep it up, basically. And so it preceded the notion of precision medicine that President Obama at the time mentioned in the State of the Union 2 years later. And what's exciting is it's become a thing now. I think we see lots of people talking about how to stop aging, how to keep your health for the rest of your life. And we've had some unique positions in that field.
This is funny timing as we're having this conversation today. It's March 29th, 2023. And I just got my copy in from, are you familiar with Dr. Peter Attia?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I just got his new book in. I'm going to butcher it. I want to say Overdrive or Override. Override. Or is it Overdrive? Someone's going to correct me and murder me in the comments. But what I really love most from his work, I love what he's doing, but what I'm hearing in your story as well, that I just really light up about traditional MDs, traditional medical providers. In my opinion, this could just be my perception, finally latching onto a lot of things that I have wanted, and a lot of us in, I'll say, more wellness-oriented, holistic medical model have wanted for a long time. Do you feel like there has always kind of been this tribe of traditional healers, MDs, that are in the same belief system as us, that there are a lot of other things going on other than just disease management, disease care? Or do you feel like the MD world, the traditional medical model world, has finally woken up and is coming around right now, and now we can really kind of merge these two worlds?
I think it's more the latter, but there's a combination of reasons for that. In medicine, we're reactive. Conventional medicine, as it's taught currently in medical schools, is not about going on a fishing expedition and trying to figure things out. It's about taking care of disease because there's so many sick people. Like thinking about the fact that we live life longer now, the great generation, so many people living above 100, they can't even mention them all on to the Today Show where they used to congratulate people, but not well. And I think doctors themselves are frustrated because the volume of care and the number of patients they have to see doesn't leave them time to really explore how you're living life. So if you can get the story from an individual, if you can understand their choices and how their habits, how they sleep or not, if they work out, if they practice any modalities like Qigong or Tai Chi or meditation, you can weave that into what are you doing to keep your health? And I think that's where the storyline has changed. Can we keep our health for the rest of our life?
What I hear you talking about there is a concept that I see a lot more now, whether it's popularity or just kind of coming back, the difference between health span and lifespan. We all have a lifespan, right? We all are born and one day we're going to die, but our health span being kind of our quality of health and our quality of life up until the very end of our lifespan, I think has become radically different and radically more important. Would you agree? And how would you kind of define health span versus lifespan?
Completely. I think you said it beautifully. Your health begins to decline. You can live a long life, but not necessarily in great shape. You can see people on the street, men and women, bent over like a walker because they got osteoporosis, a completely preventable condition in today's world, but it's hidden. You have to go beneath the surface. So if you're over 30, Chase, then that's where your body starts changing, except we don't see it. We usually don't see symptoms. And if we do, we attribute it to life has gotten more complex, need to make a living, we are raising a family, our careers are challenging, so we don't get into the gym, and we don't eat right maybe. But actually, if you even do it perfectly, you're going to decline. That's the nature of aging. And what I set my life goal to be for the work I do is to say, well, if we don't age, we won't get disease. And that's physiologically the way I think of the human body. And if we can detect it before it actually emerges, think about everything we could put to use to be able to turn that around, reverse aging, and stop chronic disease. So that's where I agree with you completely. We're living longer, but not necessarily better in today's world.
You said after 30, and anyone who hits 30 or is on the other side of it can probably really relate, or even on the other side of 30, before you get there, that's what we all hear, right? Oh, once you turn 30, things just don't work the way they used to. It takes longer to recover. It's got to do twice the work to get half the results. Personally speaking, I felt like I was kind of cheating lifespan a little bit because I didn't feel that way until I turned 36. When I turned 36, I noticed certain things in my life in terms of really muscle mass maintenance, motivation to train, recovery, just the way of being an active guy I had been my whole life. It wasn't until a little after around 36, I was like, all right, I can kind of buy into this now. I'm maybe feeling a little bit more tired, or I'm having to motivate myself a little bit more. Or just really the biggest thing for me was I noticed I was having to really do more work than usual to maintain my body composition in terms of muscle mass and body fat mass. So besides maybe what I was doing from 30 to 36 to thwart that a little bit longer, for the average person, male, female here, what is so unique about 30 that kind of triggers a lot of these things in our body that, we can maybe feel or, see?
Well, you mentioned a couple of things. First of all, it is really mid-30s, but let me put it this way. You can be 15 and you can be 55, and you can maintain to a certain degree, depending on your genetic makeup and how you choose to live life. But 30s is most common because in the 30s, that's when hormonal change begins to take root. So testosterone starts dropping by 1 to 3% a year. And that has an effect exactly what you're describing. You're classic for what I've seen for years, in that you can't sustain muscle, even if you're doing everything perfectly. We have a third of our patients are triathletes, marathon runners. They work out to beat the band. They do everything perfectly. And that's actually a little more scary, because that means their genes are having a big say in why they can't sustain who they are. So in that conversation, what I like to bring up is that everyone's unique. And so you might have been 36, somebody else might have been 29, and someone else might be 41, where they detect those differences. But it's going to happen because none of us outlive Father Time. And that's where disease begins to permeate and show up. And then we know it's there because we feel creaky. We can't get out of bed so easily. We can't play 3 full rounds of golf a week. All of that makes a difference. And that's what we turn around in folks, because we're looking at the entire system and how you differ from your cousin or your father. Because while your genes may say something, the way you express them can be very different.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's good kind of extra validation as to, all right, Chase, you're not alone.
No,
but
everybody goes through it.
we all do. We all do. And I
Yes.
do believe it is just a matter of time. In some way, you're going to feel different, not better, well, maybe worse. I don't know, but you're going to feel different. And hopefully through such conversations like this today, we're going to be able to be aware of the differences of those feelings, those sensations in the gym, in the bedroom, in our sleep. And just know the whispers that our body is giving us before it turns into a scream.
And you're lucky. You're actually lucky that you have that conversation with yourself, because there are folks, again, remember, it's the N of 1, meaning everyone is unique, even my identical twin sister and I. And we have differences. But some people don't hear their body. They just continue to decline in a way that seems almost imperceptible. And usually it's the folks who need a wake-up call, or they have a wake-up call. One of their friends, something happens to a friend or a relative, and they're like, oh my God, or unfortunately it may happen to them. They get a diagnosis. A lot of men, they get a heart attack or they get a stroke. And that's when they wake up to, what do I need to do differently? I don't want to live like this.
I know for sure one thing we need to do differently is to get tests. We need to,
Absolutely.
first and foremost, I'm the biggest advocate. Probably anytime anybody asks me a question, health related, the first thing I would typically will ask, I'd say 99% of the time, is when was your last physical? That is like the best starting point I would ever recommend for anybody. Most people, it's been over a year. So I'm going to say your first test here, before we dive into all the higher level tests, metabolic tests, testosterone tests, hormone tests, get a physical, get basic blood, then just, start from there with your provider. Beyond that, one thing that really helped me wrap my head around where I was physically, mentally, emotionally at 36 was I began to dive deeper into different metabolic tests, different genetic tests, just different testing, because I was in my mid to late 30s now. So I would like to kind of peel back a couple extra layers beyond fasting glucose, cholesterol, just basic metabolic panel. And what it did for me, as just a testimony to why these tests can really reveal such unique information to put you back on track for that original goal, but maybe shine a light on something that you had no idea was happening. One thing I found out was that it was, I forget the marker now, but basically I went through this really exhaustive genetic testing and metabolic testing. And they're like, yeah, you're a hyper metabolizer, not only in just traditional metabolism. I'm what call a hard gainer. I've got to eat 3,500 to 4,000 calories for months for me to gain weight. But also a lot of other things internally, one of them being dopamine. And so what I was correlating to my decreased or even lack of motivation to train, which was deviating me from my preferred body composition I was sharing earlier, I realized that, oh, I thought I had like a physical problem, like a physical motivational problem, but actually my body was metabolizing my drive, my excitement. I needed to actually give myself a little bit more downtime and grace when I would have really high highs, because my body needed more time to replenish my dopamine. So I was trying to like fight a different battle than I needed. So moral of the story here is, if you can lean into some of these tests, and I would love for you to please to kind of break down some of these unique metabolic tests to find out how well or poorly our body's engine is humming. the markers might surprise us. And if we can learn more about the markers that are in sync or out of whack, we can really apply the right tools and practices to get back on track.
For sure. And in that way, it's really important to understand what aspects of your genetic makeup, your family history, which is different than your genetic makeup, and your own physical well-being and mental well-being. What exactly are those drivers like you picked up in yourself? And you're right, sometimes it's a surprise. We actually start fairly in depth at the Comite Center because we're looking at a bespoke program, which looks at the entire system. Because as you understood now, your brain talks to the rest of your body. You don't have different organs in different places doing their own thing. They have to communicate. And if they don't communicate well, for example, if your thyroid isn't behaving, you can have problems with cognition. Or if you metabolize too slowly or too fast, you may need more B12 to keep your brain right as you age and not develop dementia. And folks don't understand too that like drinking wine will affect metabolic rate. The way you eat and the way you work out changes the levels of both hormones and metabolites in your system. We start very simply in the Grok app, and in there, we're looking at 5 major biomarkers in the blood. And those 5 biomarkers tell us a story about your future health trajectory and how we can stop the decline in a lot of fascinating ways, because we've collected thousands, if not millions, of biomarkers longitudinally on people, and we can see that. So that's one way we think about it. But another very important key is figuring out, besides the physical exam and how last you went to see a doctor, what runs in your family? What does your father and mother look like at, is it 30, 40, 50, 60? Are your grandparents alive and well, or did they pass away young? And those have an effect on biomarkers in a different way, because that will tell you what exactly you might be facing genetically and how we avert that if you have signs and symptoms of that already occurring. So we look at biomarkers in the blood, a half a dozen that way. We then also want to look at your percentage body fat and composition to see, have you been doing all the things you need to do to sustain muscle and not put on visceral fat, and reverse that if it's happening. So there are many ways to cut and dice it, if you will, but you should always start with what's going on in myself. What do I know about my family? How have I lived life? And then go on to get these deeper tests, this deeper dive into hormones as well as metabolites. And that means finding probably special advice that you probably share with your listeners a lot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I maybe to a fault, maybe even breaking some of my own HIPAA laws. I don't know. I share a lot of a lot of information, test results,
Right.
what I'm experiencing, what I'm liking. But it does kind of pose another question, and that's, is there such thing as too much access to information? Is there such thing as too many tests for maybe it's like right test, but wrong time, or wrong test, right person, or flip that. Maybe do we need to be waiting until we absolutely hit a certain age or present with some kind of physical experience of, feeling off, or even just, we feel like our health is, on the decline, to get a certain test? Now we can get tests delivered to our home. We can go to a outpatient clinic. We can go to our primary care provider. I feel that we can have just so much more access to so many different types of tests. It might be information overload, and we might see something that could cause a scare, but maybe unnecessarily.
That's also a very wise kind of way to think about it. So on one hand, I absolutely believe it's never too young to start. Like, it's great to establish what your baseline function is. And that means getting tests, looking at yourself in a more narrow sense, for example, in the 20s, because that's really when we peak. We know that for athletes, we know that in lots of ways, that 27 in general, because I don't go to the mean and the average. I'm looking at each individual. This is not population research. This is, what are you doing specifically? And how do I take the science of what I know and translate it to Chase, or translate it to other men or women, right? And so you should be able to detect certain clues before you're 30. And even in your teens, if something is upsetting or bothering you, or you're a little different than your brothers and sisters, and you need to know, those would be very helpful. But it has to be in the hands of someone who, as you pointed out, is going to have the ability to interpret this data, to understand the direction and the future of it for you, so that it's not scary. Because it turns out when I started this work over 2 decades ago at Yale, the internet was just coming into its own. And to me, I would get questions that showed people had more anxiety. They would look up things, not know how to position it, because most of the time you couldn't get access to medical information unless you went to the library. In the library, old data and old books turned yellow with age, but on the internet, everything glows, right? So you're there looking up 25,000 reasons you might be not able to put on muscle, and then trying to figure out what fits me. I don't look like that person. I don't look. So I think your answer crosses the span from some information is really excellent to establish a baseline. And that's why I'm hoping to bring the knowledge we've gained over the 2 decades to everybody, because I think it can only help, because you can't get access to people who really have these answers, because that's not the way, as you pointed out, conventional medicine actually works. So you need to turn to other sources, and reliable sources.
So when we're talking about metabolic tests here, which ones would you recommend? Say general population, not really knowing a whole lot of their medical history here. Let's say at 30, or even that in that 27 to maybe 30 range we're talking about. What are just good general metabolic tests for us to be looking for to get a better understanding of how well or poorly our engine is running?
So the 5 key biomarkers we look at beyond knowing your story, how do you live life? What's your family medical history like? The ages of people around you, if you know it, those are all extremely useful. The 5 biomarkers that I consider very valuable and predictive of your future health and your current health include fasting sugar and fasting insulin, along with hemoglobin A1C. And they can come together in a variety of ways. Fasting free testosterone is very critical, because that gives us a bandwidth. And I'll give you a story of one person, once I finish the list, who at 33 looks like he's 53. And the numbers said it all. There were some outward complaints, but nothing major. So going back to the last one that we look at is something called a cholesterol risk ratio, which actually takes into account your total cholesterol divided by your good cholesterol, HDL. Now, those tests are rather superficial. They're commonly done. They're not done by usually your regular doctor, your family doc, or your private doc, if anyone has a family doc nowadays. But those numbers alone have put me on a path with people and profile people where, for example, depending on the outcome, you can tell them that you've had early heart disease and stroke in your relatives, right? And they'll come back to you and say, how did you know? My father died at 60. And because the story is the same, and there are certain profiles that point that out, including those 5 tests. It's a great place to start. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think metabolic health is probably where, again, after just a general physical, is where I would agree. I think a more intensive metabolic panel would really do majority of people wonders. The more I personally have been learning about and having a lot of metabolic health experts on the show, we're finding not only what this information could do for the obvious, metabolic rate, but just, even leading to brain health, leading to mental health, mental illness. We're just seeing a lot more, correlation and causation there of if we can regulate the metabolism, if we can get that more in check and regulation, then we know that we have a lower probability for a lot of unwanted things, such as, a lot of inflammatory markers, especially in the brain health, degenerative diseases in particular, Alzheimer's, type 4 diabetes, if you want to call it.
You're absolutely right. And I have story after story. It's not just testimonials because we have the data, but we have folks in their 60s and 70s who look like and feel like and act like they're in their 30s. And that's because we've seen that interventions, once we identify and connect the dots between the way you live life, your biomarkers, your family story. We connect those dots and we actually reverse the metabolic decline. So I just had a funny story last week. One of my favorite guys has been a client for close to probably 15 years. And he's in his 80s, but he plays tennis, singles tennis several times a week. And he said to us, and when we were doing the wrap up with him, he said, I have friends who are 15 or 20 years younger than me, because when I try to play tennis with people my age, well, they're either really sick or they died. And so he puts on muscle every year. And now we're fine tuning his exercise because he's gotten in a kind of regulated kind of way of doing it. And he needs to be pumped up. He needs more, for example, high intensity interval training, and he needs some more resistance than he's doing. And so once you can pinpoint how a person is aging and why, you actually stop aging and stop disease. And we have the scientific data and evidence to back it, because I started so long ago. I started collecting it that way.
Never too early to start gathering information, whether that's, professionally or even on yourself. I'm not wearing my Apple Watch right now, actually, but, I wear an Apple Watch. I've got a Whoop activity tracker. I was definitely one of those guys years ago using a food logging app such as MyFitnessPal. So I was tracking nutrition information. I've got data on myself going 10 years. I'd say, if not even, no, probably pushing like 13 at this point. And so, definitely some years more strict than others. But I'll say this, there are so many amazing ways out there to just passively gather information about ourselves before we ever even maybe decide to finally get our physical or get a more exhaustive metabolic panel or dive into the research like you have. That information coupled with the other information is really, I think, the best approach. I always believe and say and agree with what you're talking about, N equals 1. We are a continuous study of ourselves. And so don't be afraid to test things, but more importantly, don't be afraid to measure things first so that you're making an appropriate test, whether that's sleep, movement, training, or your nutrition through like a food log.
Yeah, everything you said, I'm with you. And I can tell you that I have the Aura right on this hand right here. I'm wearing the Apple Watch, right? I have a continuous glucose monitor on, because even as an endocrinologist, and I was trained in 4 fields of endocrinology, men's health, women's health, children, and adults, all the things that cover what we talk about with aging and decline. And there's so many reasons that we can pick out and concentrate on. I think the one major area that if people are going to turn to this is to look at their sleep. And I find that the Oura Ring, Whoops, and a few other ways of monitoring it, it's not the specific numbers in it. And here's where the leap has to happen. It's the interpretation, and it's in the eyes of the beholder. So the apps and all these monitors and wearables are fantastic. I've even learned as an endocrinologist, I've convinced other endocrinologists to wear the continuous glucose monitor. And they can't believe the difference they see in like one blood draw very few weeks ago when they get the result, to continuously understanding at the point of action, like when you eat, when you work out, if you sleep, what's going on in your health. We have a couple, for example, where she has always struggled with sleep and maybe sleeps 6 hours. He sleeps probably 14 hours. And it turns out that wearing an Oura, he gets no deep sleep. He gets a fair amount of REM.
At 14 hours, he's not
14
getting
hours.
any deep
Yeah.
sleep.
And there are reasons for it under the surface and quite palpably, whereas her sleep is quality sleep. She gets both REM and both deep sleep. And she wakes up feeling rested. And so our target at first, I think sleep is a big area, but sleep and sugar and hormones and how you live life, those all come together in a way that we connect those dots. We want to interpret it. And that's where I think we need more direction, because it's in the interpretation of the path you personally are on, or this particular couple, that has us tweak interventions, what I think of as actionable recommendations, targeted to that human being that changes their path. And they're amazed. I mean, we have people coming in week after week who I know their chronological age, and yet they look and feel 15, 20 years younger and live a life that's like that. So that's where I think we're catching up with the science. The science is going to prove out what we hope, because we all want to live a long life, at least till 120. And actually, a lot of people I know are targeting 150. But you want to feel great. You want to do everything, you know, and not have to live so perfectly you can't enjoy life. That's a question I'm asked a lot. You know, can I have pasta? Just before I got on the phone call, we were interpreting 1,700 variants on one of my longstanding guys' genes. And he said, you know, I try never to have pasta. And the advice we gave him too is that keto isn't a great fit for him. He should certainly, if he does keto, he has to do it in a modified way. And we pointed out that there's, you know, lentil pastas, red lentil, there's chickpea. And if you like the taste, there are ways. And then every once in a while, of course, you can have pasta. Like, who can live life without pasta? Honestly. I mean, so, and we all have our biases. Ice cream happens to be one of my weaknesses, but.
Oh,
So
you're in good company.
Yeah, you too. Okay.
Always. Which I wanted to definitely get into sleep and how you talk about it in the book. And you do a really unique job of it in talking about sleep and stress. How quality sleep is essential for healthy longevity. And by reducing stress, we can actually contribute a lot to our well-being, overall well-being, but also getting better sleep. So what is so unique, in your opinion, about the relationship between stress and sleep? Because that's very specific. My audience has definitely heard me talk a lot about sleep health tactics, you know, morning routine, evening routine, you know, blue light blockers, caffeine, you know, cortisol, melatonin, all that stuff. What is so unique, in your opinion, about stress and sleep that we might be missing?
So stress changes your entire dynamic. Like when you're stressed, you can be, and I'm talking chronic kind of stress. You don't have control over aspects. Sometimes you can do something about it and sometimes you can't. So you have to think of ways to work around it. But stress increases cortisol in your bloodstream. Cortisol increases sugar. You're undermining what happens during sleep because you can't get restful sleep. You can't clean up the body. You can't clean up toxins. You can't go into stages where you're releasing more growth hormone. You're suppressing that if your cortisol is elevated and your sugar is high or low. And so those changes in your body at night due to stress undermine the quality of your sleep. And so that's a hard kind of hurdle in ways, and also aging will do that. So as women and men age, the way they release neurotransmitters in the brain, including hormones like testosterone and estrogen and the others, can also have an impact because they have to eat carefully, a little more carefully. They have to make sure the hours they protect to sleep are real for them. And once you get beyond that, there are interventions such as supplements or medication. And I'm not a fond of sleeping pills. I prefer other routes to that can help people get that quality sleep. But stress, find ways to kind of live life where you can sideline the stress. And if it's stressful, counteract it. Meditation, for example, is a great way to reduce cortisol. Real deep meditation through studies at Harvard and University of Wisconsin has shown that you literally turn the switch off that produces more cortisol if you meditate. So they did studies doing placebo versus real deep meditation, and it works. So there are non-intervention, non-drug type ways we can also change how we live life.
What would you recommend, if anything, when it comes to stress management for the goal of maintaining good sleep or improving poor sleep in the form of something exogenous, supplementation? We're going to actually be reaching for something, not a prescription sleep pill, but something that we can consume to help us lower stress, but push us into better sleep.
So one of my favorite, because it's growth, you want growth hormone to go up when you sleep, and you want to be able to use your metabolic system to get things primed during downtime, because that's how we function better, right? So one of the things as a supplement that I like at bedtime is arginine and ornithine. Both of them combined together actually trigger quality growth hormone release during sleep. And so that's a good way to do that. I think we've heard serotonin and increasing tryptophan. So depending on what your relationship is in terms of when you eat and how you eat, having a dinner at least 2 hours, finishing eating at least 2 hours before you go to bed, so your body can acclimate, is a much better way of going to sleep and getting quality sleep than eating right up to bedtime or grazing the way I used to, because that's when I got the hungries, right? And that's not uncommon, by the way. So those are ways that we use. Sometimes things like a warm bath, ways to calm your body and mind down, music. If you love to read and disappear into reading, or even watching a movie, but try to wrap that up an hour and a half or 2 hours before you have to sleep. Don't tune in to shows that are violent or all the news we hear, because that will increase your stress. Even if it's peripheral to you, it's scary and worrisome. And I think there are some select ways, but again, it's very dependent on that individual. One of my favorite prescription drugs, but that's been around for a long time, and I give it about 80% of the time, it works like a miracle. And this has to do more with aging phenomenon, is trazodone. So we use trazodone in very tiny amounts. And for where it works, like you find out right away, you try it, you might go up on the dose a little bit. And that somehow is great for sleep that's interrupted at night. When you get up at night and you tend to ruminate, hard for you to go back to sleep, because we have stages of sleep. So lighter stages of sleep can cause us to wake up because we're more aware. You actually get your best sleep early in the night. And that's probably another factor, Chase. I probably am going on a little too long, but it is a favorite topic, in that you want to make sure that you go to sleep early enough and try to be consistent. That's a really important aspect, so that you're not always catching up, to sleep. And I think that's actually challenging in our society. There's so much fun at night. You go out at night, you want to hang out, right? So I think making yourself aware of that. One other thing I'd like to mention, there's time. So also our genes dictate who we are. I remember a young 25-year-old a woman moving to New York. She actually had metabolic syndrome and could never lose weight, was somewhat depressed. And every night she'd party and she'd be out till midnight. And when we did her genetic analysis, it turns out she was a lark. So she could never sleep in. She was up with larks at dawn. And it's very hard to change that makeup. So if you know yourself, there are people who go to bed early. There are people who go to bed late. A lot of times those are
chronotypes, right?
Exactly. Yeah. You probably have spoken or read Dr. Matthew
Dr. Michael
Walker's
Bruce.
work.
And Matthew Walker. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so I get validated because I've monitored this in so many people longitudinally, collecting their precise kind of biomarkers. And that's why I call it precision medicine, because to me, it's old-fashioned family medicine, really tied to that human being, know that human. But now we have all this data, as you mentioned, all this information, whether it's wearables or blood markers or a family story, all of that counts, and that makes a difference. So in this young woman, we had to change and tweak a lot of things, but mainly said to her, listen, party a couple of nights a week. So maybe in the afternoon you can hang out.
Doctor's orders, party a couple times a week.
Yeah. Yes, not 7 nights a week, And then she caught up with herself, because without sleep, you can get depressed. You really can. And it changes the way you think about life.
Yeah, I mentioned Dr. Michael Bruce. He wrote a book years ago called The Power of When that introduced me for the first time to this concept of chronotypes. And that's this whole other unique aspect. I love what we're talking about here, that there are so many different ways to know thyself, to be a study of one, through getting really unique, intense panels, but also just understanding yourself, understanding how do I naturally prefer to show up in the world? When, where, why, and how do I have high energy, low energy? When do I feel most activated, turned on? He has all these different models of you're a dolphin, you're a bear, you're a lion. I think they're like 4 or 5 different, types, of animals, how they present in the animal kingdom, when they thrive, when they're asleep, when they're hunt, when they're on the kill, when they're mating. And so that really shined a great light for me on, oh, okay, cool. I can understand my physiological, biochemical self in a unique way, but then also myself as a whole, how I'm showing up in the world, and really bridge those two together. So I'll make sure to put that in the show notes for everybody as well. But Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, and then Michael Bruce, The Power of When, incredible reads on
It sounds
all different
fascinating.
instances.
I have not seen his data. I will tell you, it reminds me of a patient too, who every winter her thyroid would become sluggish and she would gain weight. And I started searching in the medical literature and found a paper that described what happens to bears as happens to a select profile of people. And she was exactly like that.
She was a bear.
She was a bear. She needed to sleep more and she needed to hibernate during the winter. Her thyroid slowed down. So we have these kind of genes that we have to understand how they're playing out in us. And I think your point was so well made. You have to match it to the choices you make in life. And sometimes you have to give up some stuff, but I don't believe in giving up all of it. You still need that joy de vivre to like live life to the fullest. And, you know, if you love to ski, you want to be skiing over 100, right? You don't want to stop. And so that's fascinating. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. It really unique research. I had him on the show. I think this was like maybe the first year of the podcast. He might've been one of my first like 20 or 30 guests. Really fascinating stuff. Something new I'm applying in my, I'll say first sleep health protocol, but the more I'm understanding it, the more I'm reading about it, I do see a big carryover to a lot of other areas in my health, human health. Are you familiar with mouth taping?
Yes, but go on. I'd love to hear. Yeah.
I just recently, I connected with a friend on a podcast in Seattle, maybe like 2 weeks ago, and he is swearing by it. And he gave me this bag, and it's basically more or less kinesio tape, like athletic tape that's really stretchy, really adhesive, and it's cut out into little ovals. But people literally can just take a piece of Scotch tape, they put it on their lips so that when you go to sleep, you don't allow your body to breathe in and out of your mouth, which immediately I can get on board with. Well, if we're not breathing out of our mouth, then we're not going to be snoring. And I know if we're not snoring, we're getting better sleep, less disturbed sleep for ourselves. And if we have a partner, they're definitely more happy, which so
big
far
win.
2 weeks in, my wife is a big fan of it. But I'm also tracking so far information of mouth taping on my Whoop. And I got to say, I think it's a little bit too early to really talk about it. But I will say this, given that this is pretty much the only new variable I've introduced to my sleep health protocol, on top of being, real scientific term here, out of whack with a lot of my other sleep health protocols, because the last 2 weeks I've been traveling a lot more. I'm in different time zones, different beds, different light. I've had more alcohol than usual, in different social events and things like that, more than usual for me. So all of those things, which definitely, personally speaking, tend to derail pretty quickly my sleep health. Mouth taping, my sleep data is still looking pretty good on my Whoop. So I can't wait to keep it running. I want to give it at least 30 days now that I'm back home in my normal routine, and really see, all right, with everything else being normal, this one extra variable of mouth taping, what really is this going to do for me? Besides help my marriage and, help my wife stay asleep.
So perfect, all great points. And I agree. I think if you can do something, I would do one thing at a time. So one tip that I like, to say as a scientist, because I've been a research clinician, kind of clinician and scientist my whole career, is make a change and then monitor yourself. And you're doing it exactly right. You've done it through a traumatic time where you're traveling and changing time zones, which, by the way, turns genes on and off at different times for you. That's why most people, when they change time zones, become diabetic. Lots of studies on that. And then you have to revert. And the older decades take longer to revert. It even happens in 20 something, 30, 40, 50. And so you have to be cautious about that. It's not just the jet lag of not sleeping. It's what changes in your body, and the liver turns on and off in terms of specific genes at the time zone you live in. So go an hour.
Another great point to be made here you're talking about Matthew Walker, his whole work around this concept of circadian rhythm, not only in how it relates to our sleep health, but everything you're highlighting here blew my mind. How we all kind of have this slight different range of our circadian rhythm. It's not exactly 24 hours.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're stirring all this up for me now. So another great reason to go check out his book, everybody.
Now, the only thing I would say for you personally, and for anybody who's listening, you really do want to get a sleep study. And there are lots of sleep studies that can be done at home now, because if you have sleep apnea, that is one challenge. And that's very common, obstructive sleep apnea. It's not necessarily only as people gain weight as they get older. It comes about for other reasons too. It depends on the larynx, the way you breathe, the position you sleep in. But the real danger is central sleep apnea. I have a longstanding relationship with the chair of a department of cardiothoracic disease and well-known academician who called because he was getting 10 hours a night going to bed. His wife was a doctor too, didn't have great heart either. And he was attributing his underlying sleep, feeling no energy when he woke up, to his heart, and maybe something was going on. He wasn't getting quality sleep. It turns out he had central sleep apnea, and that will kill somebody. So getting a sleep study to rule out if you have sleep apnea, if it's central sleep apnea, that absolutely requires treatment. So I would just, a little cautionary tale that if you haven't gotten tested, think about doing so.
Wholeheartedly agree. And another quick little point I want to make to this, my point earlier of sometimes we get a test and, it could be right test, wrong time, or it might, my words here, give a false positive or a false negative, in that
Right.
we might take a specific test. And what I'm talking about here specifically for me was years ago, I did take a pretty exhaustive sleep test. I went in to the hospital, they monitored me overnight, had all the leads and everything, which, if anybody can get good sleep with all that crap hooked up to you, props to you. Luckily, I can pass out like that, no problem. I credit a lot of my time in the military to being able to sleep in a hole while shit's being blown up around me, and I can fall asleep because it's the only sleep I'm going to get.
I'm with you.
So thank you, Army, for that, I guess. But what I'm trying to say here is, I went in because I was kind of feeling poor sleep, and I wanted to know if I had sleep apnea, because my partner at the time was telling me, you snore like bad. And it came back like, no sleep apnea. But so for them to say, you took this big mile marker test, you failed it in that you don't meet these standards, so that's a good thing. But that didn't mean that I didn't have things to work on to improve my sleep. So someone might take results like that and go, oh, well, if I don't have it, then I'm good. Then I don't need to do anything. Then it's just the way that I am. It might just be right test, wrong time, or wrong test, wrong application.
Absolutely. That's why you're right. And sometimes interpreting things as a standard doesn't mean you're not on an edge. So we look at things as a spectrum. And some people, like a lot of times, if you have an infection, your white count may not reach the total or exceed it. And you might be told, well, you're fine because you're in the range. But if you look at trends, as you're following yourself now, you're looking at your own trend in sleep. That's why I would still suggest, I don't know when you did that test, time to do it again. And you could do it at home.
Over a decade. Yeah, it was actually right after I got out of the military. It's probably like 2010, maybe.
And you were how young then?
25.
Right. So this is this era for you is a good time to do a at-home sleep test, but going about it the way you're doing it is fine. I just think we want to be cautious that if there are underlying problems, they're not obscured by thinking we're getting it fixed, because sometimes it's important to get that expert, and to test it. And nowadays it's like another wearable. You can do it at home. My husband just did it, found out when he slept on his back, he snores. So now, of course, one of my jobs during the night, because I'm like you, I can sleep through storms, through anything. And I have to make sure he's not on his back. So, because he doesn't want to use a CPAP. So he's gonna not sleep on his back. It doesn't wake me up, but it disturbs his sleep. So he gets agitated that he's not as rested as he could be.
This is a whole nother avenue we could go down of a great test to get is, being in a quality, meaningful relationship. This might not be a blood test or a sleep test, but, take the partner test, check in with them, because, again, I didn't know about this. This was years ago, but there are so many other things, I'm sure, that we could really probably get a snapshot of. We can measure in a quantitative or even qualitative way of like a hard number or a sensation or feeling from our partners. Hey, what do you notice about me energy wise, eating habits, sleep health? Kind of get that maybe hard truth sometimes, but this is a great opportunity to step out of our own selves. It's free, other than maybe getting some hard truth. We don't have a copay with our partner here to get this information.
One hopes.
Perhaps, well, maybe I guess my wife, if she wanted to, she could probably make that a billable hour. Anything I wanted to ask her. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I think it's a great idea. I think that, we all read and hear about toxic relationships, but speaking of, sleep issues, apparently now people, when they list themselves on Match or whatever to find people, they're asking about chronotypes that you brought up before. Are you
No way.
yes, because then it's more compatible. Now, I sometimes think opposites are good. You get the house alone at night or alone in the morning, but you then have to make arrangements to get together in between or something. But
I
yeah,
love where this
totally
is going.
agree.
If I was single and dating this day and age, I would request, like, what's your Whoop score every day? Monday through Saturday.
How rested are you?
Exactly. Yeah. I need
How
to
do you
know.
eat, by the way? Do you fast every
Exactly.
morning? Are we going to save some money on food, because we don't have to eat breakfast, right?
That's a really interesting model. I mean, imagine these apps, these platforms. It's a little bit of a tangent. And also, I want to be mindful of your time. I know we're a little over top of the hour. Do you have a few more minutes?
I have a few more minutes here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Something really to be mindful of here. And actually, let's segue into another topic I want to talk to you about. And that's our sex health, our sex life. Knowing these things about ourselves and even knowing these things about our partner or potential future partner, not only increase compatibility, I think arguably across the board on a lot of things, but when we get down to business, I think that's going to make each of us the best self showing up for another really important area of our total well-being, and that's our sex life. So what is going on in, you kind of describe it here as great sex, your second act, specifically for us guys, boosting libido, gaining from our erections, and making your sex life sizzle again. What is so important about our sex life, and how does it relate to all these other N=1 and testing components that we've been talking about?
One of my favorite topics. In fact, I probably teach that very commonly here because it's not probed very well whether it's conventional medicine or even taught in school. It's fascinating that sex is a big part of our life, and yet we know nothing.
We get like a 1-hour video from our gym teacher about the sex life and STDs, and that's our sex ed.
Right. Yeah. Use condoms and say no.
Don't have sex.
Don't have sex. It's better. But so with every decline, as we hit each decade, our life changes. Now, there are people on average where once a month, twice a week, every night, and everyone falls again into a different level of sort of what their interest is. And we break it up actually into 3 categories. The way I think about it is, how interested are you? How active can you be? How spontaneous can it be? Can you sustain an erection if it's a male? Can you get erection spontaneously? That tends to start disappearing, even as men think in their 40s and 50s, oh my God, I'm fine. And then when we ask them a little differently, well, how do you compare yourself to when you were 20? And usually the first thing that might come up is, well, I'm in this regular relationship and I'm married and I have 3 kids and they're always knocking on the door. And we try to get beyond that to say, well, if you really think about it, because it's not about just the varieties of life, that sort of, but more about how your body is performing and what your mind is telling you. And it's not uncommon when we find that low free testosterone that men are compensating, because some men have powerful minds and they can sustain a great sex life, but not realize how different it is and how difficult it is. And other times for women too, in women, their libido naturally dissipates. They lose the little testosterone that women have in their 30s, and it's way before menopause, and it's not even approved. Actually, you have to be a doctor to prescribe it. It's not a regularly approved hormone. So men and women have different issues that affect both their sex life, and that then extends to their heart health. Like men get heart disease earlier than women. Women get bone loss earlier than men, and that has to do with the combination of estrogen, more estrogen in women, more testosterone in men. So the sex life is an important barometer of how you're feeling. Like a young man in their 30s, if they're already saying, I'm not that interested and I don't have great, libido, that's a poor sign, because actually, biologically speaking, the pudendal arteries that feed the penis are 1/4 of the size of the coronary arteries. And so that is a sign of potential cardiac disease 10 or 20 years later.
So am I hearing you correctly that for
erectile
a guy,
dysfunction.
saying that in his 30s, already early 30s, already stating, I am becoming less interested in having sex. My libido is less than it used to be, maybe even gone, could be an indicator, future indicator of cardiovascular disease?
Yes. And
Wow.
initially the indicator might be difficulty sustaining erections, but it comes down to having low testosterone. It changes your mindset. You can overcome it. Believe me, there are a lot of men with very low T's who say their sex life is just fine. We're not in there measuring it. We get the reports, but the truth is in the subsequent behavior. When you start finding these less than optimal numbers and values and starting to slowly optimize, the change is dramatic. So I've had people call a couple weeks, a month into our helping them recover and getting on a path to optimal health for life. And they'll say, hey, can you tune it down a little bit? I'm like feeling it's way too much. I have lots of those stories. So it's fun and it's an important part of life because it's great for sleep for some people. It's also reinforces your ability to feel important and to other people and to yourself. So it makes you feel good. And those are kind of issues in terms of biomarkers, if you will. You just have to go to those blue zone to talk about socialization, being part of society and engaging and not being just a loner. It's actually really hard if you're not that interested, you're a little more nervous to get out there. So we hear that a lot, for example, when partners separate, whether they're same sex, different, doesn't matter. It really affects the quality of life.
Couple quick questions here to wrap up this section and get us to our final question. You said it, perked up my ears. I got to ask, spontaneous erection, what's that about? I think every guy can relate. That absolutely is a thing, or at least in my experience. What is that about? Is that all of a sudden a massive influx of testosterone, or are we passively thinking about something that causes arousal and we don't realize it? Secondly, loosely related here, in a partnership, or let's say I want to have more sex, my partner wants to have more sex. Should we be approaching that conversation, again, kind of blanket statement here, should we be approaching that, hey, I want to improve our sex life through trying to increase our sexual activity, by just the obvious approaches to having more sex, more spontaneity? Or should we maybe be stepping back and going, what maybe is more the biochemical, physiological drivers to me wanting it more, or to you wanting it more? And will that kind of get us to where we want eventually anyway?
Well, you're almost answering your questions in the way you're describing it.
Okay.
It's actually both. It's both. Of course, you want to be your authentic self. Otherwise, why be in a relationship? I mean, you may get other benefits from it. Maybe you need a place to live or better food, or you just friends with, whatever benefits. But there is a biochemical underpinning to it that I would encourage people to explore, because if it's beyond your ability to change who you are, let's say you have very little interest, and being sexually active once a month for you or your partner is okay. It's more than enough. And maybe the other partner is like every night would be great, and also that changes over your lifespan. So being able to get all the variables and that knowledge that you can then use for the wisdom to be able to say, let's approach this. Where are we going to go with it? What can I do to improve it? Kind of look at it where, unfortunately, some couples have to work on fertility, and this actually takes an effort. For many of us, we'd like to think of sex as spontaneous, and you don't have to think too much about it. It should be natural. There's a lot of moving parts in being sexually active. And when you spoke to the spontaneous erection, for example, to segue into that, it has to do with neurotransmitters and the nervous system. And yes, you can be having thoughts about, something that's exciting, or seeing someone pass by, whether you're in a relationship or not. And
sometimes for guys, I feel like it's literally just the certain way the wind blows. And it's just like the same level of arousal, and other times, it's just at the most inconvenient time. It just, it's wildly inappropriate. But it's just, I don't know, as a guy, I feel like it's something that we're always just like, what the hell's going on?
So there are surges of pituitary hormones called LH and FSH that in men very differently than women. And we age very differently too, by the way, in terms of menopause and andropause in men. But to be, as quick about it as I can, those the changes in those pituitary brain hormones, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the testes, cause these fluxes. And that works together with your neurological system, the parasympathetic and sympathetic, to cause these urges and spontaneous erections that you may have little control over. And so, but the most common is waking up in the morning, because testosterone is usually highest in the morning, certainly in puberty, and then later on in life, it could be the same, but those eventually dissipate because of the reduced testosterone, but also neurotransmitters that interact in that way. So it's complicated, but it's not impossible to sort out. And again, it requires some exploration. Maybe after you do your sleep, we can have a session on sexual function.
Okay.
And we have a lot of couples here of all stripes and colors, and it's a fun thing to do. And a lot of times we get the other partner, because the change is so dramatic sexually, that the other partner calls and says, hey, I need to get some help too here. So, yeah.
You've created a monster.
Exactly. No, exactly.
What markers, if there are just one or two real quick, that you would recommend for a male and a female to get if they are looking to optimize their libido, sex drive, sex health? Like, what one or two couple markers should they really be looking at to optimize, to bring up for improving sexual life for themselves, but also maybe, you know, to kind of help their partner understand why their drive is maybe different?
So those blood markers are really why I picked them, because they answer in so many variables of life. It seems amazing to me after doing like 125 at a baseline that I see that through the app Grok Health, that we can see the changes and what's going on in individual. Same one I mentioned, I said his testosterone was like a 50-year-old when he was only 30 years young. Pointed out that, and he had those complaints in his story that he wasn't as interested, erections were harder, he's putting on some weight around the middle. For women to make that point, it's actually birth control pills in young women can undermine testosterone. It suppresses testosterone. So a lot of times we see young women for different reasons. It's a good test of other things too, like your sugar, because if you don't have testosterone, you're not going to be able to make muscle and put away glucose and sugar. So your system is triggered. It's almost like a test for your future diabetes. And so those 5 tests really, Chase, I was kind of shocked, because at first I was panicked when I was told I was creating this app and I'm not going to have the luxury of like 100+ biomarkers to start. What are the most important biomarkers that change the direction of your current and future health? And those 5 really would give us tremendous insight into your sex life, into your sleep, into your risk of heart disease, diabetes. It's just incredible to me that data, now we have that data and it's so useful. So that's what I would ask for.
Amazing. Well, I feel like I'm kind of kicking into next gear with you, but I want to be mindful of your time. This stuff is so interesting to me, but also personally appealing and, you know, even validating, and hopefully for my audience as well, because 6+ years now of the show, what I have tried to do is to bring experts such as yourself to longer pieces of content here on the podcast to expand on things that are curious to me, that I'm exploring, that I'm finding great success in, or I'm hoping to embark upon in all areas of my wellness. And for me, this is exactly it. I feel like someone who is now 37, I have been on my wellness journey for 17 years now. I'm at a place where I have a lot of things I want to maintain, but I want to just fine tune a couple more. But now I'm in the next stage biologically. You know, I'm kind of at a different baseline now because I'm quite literally going through a lot of different changes. And I know my audience can relate to this. So many great things here. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to make sure to have the book listed for everybody. Keep it up, your health, your body, your energy, your strength. A lot of great science on your end. And I really enjoyed how you had like inputs from people, you know, patients and other anecdotal kind of experience, because I think that really does help humanize science in a way we all can appreciate and also even better understand.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share some of our findings and where it can go for each person. We are each complex, like there's no doubt about it. We don't know what we don't know in medicine. So applying the facts that we can to give a person optimal life for longevity is, to me, a fantastic gift. I'm delighted. And so if you're interested and you want to send as a follow-up any of your lab data, I'm happy to take a look at it also, because it sounds like you've been doing great. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably take you up on that. Thank you so much. This last year has been a lot more exhaustive for me in terms of labs and panels, getting very in-depth, exhaustive panels on, like I said, genetics, metabolics, hormones, and really getting a much more deep snapshot of who I am, quite literally what makes me tick, to know what I got working for me out of the gate and what I need to really focus more on.
And that's who takes that data and helps weave it together and looks at it. Is your wife working with you on that in consult?
Yeah, my wife, yes, a little bit.
Great.
I've gone through a couple other different services, such as Wild Health, is a online functional medicine telehealth company.
The Kentucky group. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
I think they've
with
been
them.
sold since then. Yeah.
Yeah, they got acquired, I think, like late last summer. And I went with them for my genetics testing, which was probably the most in-depth thing ever I have gotten. And honestly, they gave me an hour and 15 minutes with a doctor. I've never had that long ever with a primary care provider. And then also Blokes Health, men's optimization telehealth company for testosterone replacement therapy, peptide therapy, and just, optimization as well. So I've been kind of doing, working with my wife, my FNP provider, telehealth in a couple of different ways. And then just me, I'm very in tune with my body, and I understand a lot of these things. Also, it's what I used to do to a certain degree, being a clinical health coach for many years. I worked in concierge medicine. And so I'm able to kind of just like bring it all together now.
Cool. Great. Well, this was fun. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. And before we go, I have to ask my final question. In a way, I think you just kind of answered it. Living a life ever forward. When you hear those words, when I ask you that question, what does that mean to you? How would you kind of define living a life ever forward through the lens of what you do and the work that you provide?
To me, your life is about how you can live it to the max and keep your health forever. And that's like having a crystal ball to predict the path you're on and then reverse it and own your own health destiny, not allow genes to dictate, not allow just because that's the way I am, but rather put some action into partnering with the right kind of partners to understand how you can optimize your future health trajectory, if that makes sense.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Thank you so much.